Have you ever had a question at your church and you brought it up? Maybe you did it in person, maybe you did it through text message, or maybe you did it through even something as new as Facebook Messenger, only to get crickets for a response. In other words, absolute silence. Or maybe even worse, they'll do the, hey, let me look into that, and never actually get back with you. Or maybe you're searching for a church and you have some questions about that church that aren't really clear either on their Facebook page, or maybe you visited once in a message, or whatever the case may be. And you message that church and they give you the basic typical reply, thanks for messaging us, we'll get right back with you, only for them to never actually get back with you. Sadly, this is something that is all too common in the church, and I, for one, know from personal experience, having traveling this country for the last 19 years, having to move every 2 to 3 years because of my job, going from church to church to church. This is something that is way too common. And I want to talk about it in today's episode and discuss, number one, what is the real issue with this? Number two, some considerations to take in mind for pastors and for the congregations. And then number three, I want to give some suggestions on how we can make this better. Because if churches are not responding to the congregation, then those leaders are failing. And number two, if the congregation is not understanding the proper process of how we should go about this, we are failing as a church as well, because we're not informing our people on how this should go. So all that and more on today's episode of I Believe. Now what? Hey everybody, if this is your first time here, my name is Tim. This is I Believe Now What. We are a podcast, a YouTube channel, whatever you want to call it, that is just geared towards glorifying God and talking about that now what that comes after we believe. And in that, a lot of the stuff has to do with church and how we do it. And when I'm talking about church, I'm talking about the place that we gather. If you didn't know, there are really two definitions of church that we mostly use. One is the invisible body of Christ. That is his bride. That is every single believer. We are the church. And then another definition of it could be the physical place that we gather at. And you would normally see this in your local congregations. And just as we talked about in the introduction, I want to talk about a topic that is honestly so crucial, and it hits really close to home for me. Now, it might be hard to see from my standpoint if you've been living in the same town your entire life and maybe you've been going to the same church, but for people who happen to move around, or people who move around a lot like me, being active duty in the military, you have to find a new church every time you pack up and move. And in that, you are constantly having to go back and forth with the church because you want to make sure that you are going to a good, solid church. And in that comes conversations with that church, especially in the beginning processes. But not only that, conversations that happen even after you've been in a church for a few years. And it's important that the churches answer these questions, because if the congregation has questions that need to be asked, these are things that should be answered. And I want to go back to the Bible to go ahead and validate this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul is beginning to address questions that the church in Corinth previously wrote to him. Now, we don't have that letter, as far as we know of, that the church in Corinth wrote to the Apostle Paul and what questions they exactly asked him, but rather you can kind of surmise based upon that chapter's context. But regardless of the fact, the point is, Paul took the time to respond to their questions. And this sets a precedence that leaders of a church should respond to questions when asked. Even the Apostle Paul, in his very busy schedule and his many missionary journeys, took the time to write a letter and get it sent off to the Corinthian church in order to answer these questions for them. And this gets into our first topic. As a leader inside of a church that God has appointed you as a leader over a congregation of people, you, whether you are a pastor, elder, whatever title you want to call it, you are a leader of that congregation, and God has put you in that place. You have a responsibility to the congregation to answer these questions. Sadly, I can show you a plethora of times where I have written either pastors, elders, or deacons within churches that I have gone to and never really got a response back. They would maybe message me with a quick, hey, we'll get right back to you, or hey, let me just read into this a little bit, and they'll never end up responding. And you go to follow up and it'll be, oh, hey, I forgot about that. Or maybe they just never bring it back up again in the first place. The issue with that is it shows that you as a church, you as a leader, and the leadership of that church as a whole really does not care about the congregation. I want to share with you a story from a good friend of mine who is a recent convert into Christianity. He's new to church life, and he started attending a church that he was familiar with. And in this, he would have a lot of questions, as many newer Christians do, and the pastor simply would normally just brush him off. He would act like he had better things to do with his time and try to rush away from confrontational questions that are hard to answer. He would send him text messages and phone calls and try to set up meetings, but it was never very successful. Now, this isn't always going to be the case in every single church, and it's always going to be dependent, but the fact of the matter was, if this person did not have solid people around him to go ahead and build him up and to really disciple him in this Christian process, who knows what would have happened to him. If this church was a solid church and the pastor was just simply so busy that he was unable to answer questions, well, you just lost that person to maybe the world, or maybe they weren't truly saved to begin with, but they were curious about Christianity. One of the most common things I see churches talking about today is discipleship and how important discipleship is, and I 100% wholeheartedly agree. But is it something that we simply just preach on Sunday mornings from the pulpit, and when it comes down to actually doing the hard work of discipling people, are we just ignoring the new Christians that walk into our church, or even the seasoned Christians who maybe have some tough questions? Oftentimes we can go back to the Bible and look at the disciples of Jesus, and they asked him a multitude of questions, and I can't even imagine how many questions they asked Jesus that were never even recorded, and Jesus always seems to answer their questions. Now, granted, this is Jesus. A pastor is a pastor, and he's definitely not Jesus, but this sets a precedence for pastors to respond to the people that they disciple, for elders to respond to the people that they disciple. And even, yes, you as a Christian, if you lead someone to Christ and start discipling them, you need to be there and available to answer these questions for them. From my personal experience, I can show you a whole list of Facebook messages that I have written to churches when I moved to a new area, because honestly, almost every single church today has a Facebook, and they usually have a Facebook Messenger set up, and I would ask them a simple question. Hey, where do we land on this issue? Where do we land on this issue? And I would get nothing in response. Every now and again, I might get a response saying, hey, let me look into this, only for them to, once again, as I've said earlier, never get back to me on the question. And in a new church search, that just tells me that, hey, this church really does not see the people of their congregation as a priority, but rather they are just so focused on their ministry goals or whatever the case may be. I even remember one time I was going on behalf of somebody else and messaging churches for good Christian counselors in the area because they were going through a very serious issue. And I wanted to make sure that this person knew that there were churches out there that would respond and give good suggestions for this Christian counseling. And in all the churches that I have contacted, I received zero. I received no messages regarding that. I've gotten a couple of the, hey, we'll get right back with you. Hey, we'll be praying for you, but nothing in the fact of a follow-up or anything like that. This honestly says a lot about where a church's priority is when you won't even respond to somebody who is asking for help and reaching out on behalf of others for the well-being of the body of Christ. Hey guys, so while I was editing this video, something amazing happened, and the pastor of the church that I reached out to in this situation actually finally commented back. They were very apologetic. They honestly were very, very sorry that they missed this message, and honestly, I wanted to make sure that that was highlighted here. I'm not naming the church, so I mean, maybe it doesn't make a big deal, but I wanted to make sure that that got in here, that this pastor actually did come back and reach out, and just really how important that is when you reach out in these situations, and what that says about this church's, this pastor's character, that yes, they may have missed the mark in immediate responding, but when they saw the error, they corrected it. And that really boils down to the bottom line. When a church is not making the people inside that congregation the priority, but rather it is a platform for the pastor to get his name out there, or the brand name of the church, or whatever the case may be. I'm not going to speculate on everything that can possibly happen, but it just shows that the people inside that congregation are not a priority. And it's definitely not the way the Bible ever said that we should conduct church, as in the gathering. As I said earlier in the video, I am in the military, and anybody who has joined the military ever since the invention of the smartphone understands that a lot of communication goes through text messaging, whether it's mass group text or individual text, emails, you name it. That's how a lot of communication gets done when we are not physically with each other. And in that, as my job as a leader, when a soldier messages me, it is my duty and responsibility to be able to give that soldier a reply back. Maybe I'm not going to be able to do it within 0.2 seconds or anything like that, but I'm going to give that soldier a reply back and answer their question. Otherwise, I, as a leader in the military, am failing that soldier. And what are they going to think about me? That I am not making them a priority, and my priorities lie somewhere else. As a pastor, as an elder, especially if you are on full-time staff and you are being paid to do this, this is your job. This is your duty to go ahead and respond to the needs of your people, whether it would be a theological question that they have, or a question about a specific verse, or maybe they are going through an issue and they need some help or advice. We as leaders are supposed to be there to respond. It is literally our job. And in some cases, it is what you get paid to do. Never mind the fact that when you are a leader of a church, this is something that is supposed to be ordained by God in a calling. One of the key buzzwords that goes around today all over social media is something called church hurt. And if you've never heard of it before, basically, it's when somebody has had a bad experience with a church, and that has had a lasting effect on them, almost to the point where they never wanted to go to church again. And hopefully they get through that situation, because regardless, there are good churches out there. You just sadly have to look, or maybe you got to drive a little bit more than just 15 minutes away from your house to get there. But this buzzword of church hurt is a real thing, because there are people that have been hurt through the church, and it could be a variety of different situations, but one of them could be unresponsiveness from the leadership within inside that church, all the while giving Christians and churches a bad name. What that essentially boils down to is being a hypocrite, and we can actually see this addressed in the Bible in Romans chapter 2. Now, for the context of this passage, this is talking about the nation of Israel and their hypocrisy, as they were supposed to be salt and a light to the world. They were supposed to be carrying these commandments of God, the ways of God, and pointing people to salvation. And while they loved to embrace that role about pointing people to salvation, they were being hypocrites themselves. And it reads in Romans chapter 2, verse 24, and we're going to go ahead and start up a little ways before that for context sake. You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one shall not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who arbor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law through your breaking of the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. What Paul was getting at was that God was getting a bad name from people outside the Jewish faith, outside in the Gentile world, because of the hypocrisy of the Jews. And while that context is specifically meant for that, we can take some lessons from that and apply it to us today, especially in the fact of churches who preach one thing and say we're all about discipleship, we're all about love, we're all about being there for each other, but yet when the time comes to actually be there for each other, we ignore them. Another key buzzword that's been going around lately is the word deconstruction. And while honestly, I am not a huge fan of that word, and that word holds multiple meanings for different people, one of the big reasons why so many people are quote unquote deconstructing is because they were being taught one thing, but seeing something different out of their leadership. And this can talk to a much broader range of things than just simply not being responsive, but it's definitely included in that. We see so many Christians deconstructing because of the hypocrisy that they have seen in church leadership. How many times have we seen a church that has been on the up and up only to see their leader leaders fail and fall.
Founder of the megachurch Hillsong, Brian Houston, has resigned after an internal investigation found he behaved inappropriately towards two women.
Cover story: Carl Lentz was a prominent pastor at Hillsong Church until he was fired after he admitted to an affair.
Whether it be because of sexual immorality, whether it be because of pornography, whether it be because of lying, deceit, gossip, you name it, put whatever sin you want on it, they'll see the hypocrisy and say, why do I want to be a part of this when the leaders that I'm supposed to be looking towards can't even follow what they are preaching? As we always say in the Army, our job as leaders is to lead from the front. And when you're leading from the front, that means you are setting the example and you are showing what you embody, what you ideal. You speak not only through your words, but through your actions. And as leaders of a church, if we are talking about discipleship and we are talking about loving one another and we are talking about just putting your arms around your fellow brothers and sisters, but you are not responsive to them, then you are showing them that you are all talk and no walk. And sadly, this will result in many people either turning around and walking away and never coming back, or in the best case scenario, just finding a new church to go to, and hopefully they find a good leadership in that church. While it may sound like I am just intentionally beating up on Christian leadership, I do want the congregations to also keep in mind some considerations. Number one, a pastor is very, very busy, especially when it comes to the size of that congregation. And I can go off on a side tangent on why I believe churches really shouldn't get into that mega church mentality, because it's, the pastor only has so much capacity to be able to serve so many people. But I'll go ahead and digress from that because that's a totally different topic for another video on another day. But the fact of the matter still remains, whether the congregation's the size of 30 or the congregation's the size of 3,000, the pastor is very busy. And I know this just from my short time of being an interim pastor at a local congregation I was at down in southern Louisiana. This congregation was small. It only had roughly about 30 to 35 members inside that church that would consistently come every Sunday. And mind you, I was doing all this while working my full-time job in the military. Now, that certain job that I was working in the military was not as labor intensive as many of the other duties that I've had to fulfill. So I was actually able to step in that role for a temporary period of time as that church was searching for a pastor. But regardless of that, my free time that I had apart from my actual job in the military was constantly consumed with being this church's interim pastor, because honestly, this is why I personally recommend a pastor should be a full-time job, which is why I would never have committed to actually being a full-time pastor until I left the military. Because even in that short time, all of my free time was consumed with figuring out the sermon, writing the message, answering phone calls, doing things inside the church that a lot of people don't see behind the backgrounds, whether it was moving pews or doing renovations or financial meetings, answering questions through Facebook Messenger and text message, and you name it. These were all things that pastors have to deal with. And once again, I want to say this was a congregation the size of about 30 to 35 people. It wasn't that large. Now picture that for a congregation the size of 150. Picture that for the size of a congregation up to 300, and keep going on up the ladder. It's just going to continue increasing that workload. So congregations have to understand that their leadership is busy. Another consideration to take in mind is that you don't always have to go through the pastor. In a good church, you have a system set up where you have elders. Maybe they have different names or they just call them all associate pastors, but you have elders, you have people in charge that can help out the pastor in these situations. And we can go back to the Bible to go ahead and validate this. For the context of this, you should read Exodus chapter 18 in its full, but I'll just go ahead and give you a short summary and then read you a few passages from it. Basically, Moses' father-in-law Jethro comes to visit. He sees Moses doing a whole bunch of work and taking on all these tasks. He's overburdened, he's overworked, so he decides to have a little chat with him. Starting at verse 13, it reads, "The next day Moses took his seat to hear the people's disputes against each other. They waited before him from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he asked, 'What are you really accomplishing here? Why are you trying to do all this alone while everyone stands around you from morning till evening?' Moses replied, "Because the people come to me to get a ruling from God. When a dispute arises, they come to me, and I am the one who settles the case between the quarreling parties. I inform the people of God's decrees and give them his instructions." "This is not good," Moses' father-in-law exclaimed. "You are going to wear yourself out, and the people too. This job is too heavy a burden for you to handle all by yourself. Now listen to me, and let me give you a word of advice, and may God be with you. You should continue to be the people's representative before God, bringing their disputes to him. Teach them God's decrees and give them his instructions. Show them how to conduct their lives, but select from all the people some capable, honest men who fear God and hate bribes. Appoint them as leaders over the groups of 1,000, 150, and 10. They should always be available to solve the people's common disputes, but have them bring the major cases to you. Let the leaders decide the smaller matters themselves. They will help you carry the load, making the task easier for you. If you follow this advice and God commands you to do so, then you will be able to endure the pressures, and all these people will go home in peace." Basically, if you want to just get a quick summary of that, Moses' father-in-law told him, "Hey, look, you're overworking yourself. Stop doing this. Delegate the task down to people. Let them deal with the small stuff while you focus on the big stuff." This is honestly a twofold thing when it comes to it. One, as congregations, understand that every single issue that you have does not need to go before the pastor. Yes, pastors need to be available. Pastors need to be responsive. But every single issue that you have doesn't have to go before that senior pastor inside that church. Rather, you can bring it up to the elders or even the deacons, depending on what the situation is. And the other side of the coin is for leaders inside the church. Stop being a micromanager. Delegate these tasks out to different people. I have met some pastors in my life who are good, godly men, but they could not let go of control, whether it was mistrust or maybe they didn't think things were going to get done right. They wanted to have absolute control, and they would overwork themselves, often sacrificing their health and even sometimes their families in that process. As leaders, delegate these roles, grow other leaders in Christ, so that way you can multiply these leaders and push them out to other churches as they mature in God's timing. As leaders, you should be growing new leaders within inside that church. Don't micromanage and keep all the tasks to yourself, but rather delegate it out and only deal with the big stuff. While there are a lot of other considerations that we can talk about, I really think a lot of those fall within those main two. Number one, for the congregation's understanding that the pastor is very, very busy. And number two, that every single question does not need to get filtered through that senior pastor, but rather other people within leadership, or even maybe somebody who disciples you, can receive that question first. So now that we talked about these considerations to keep in mind, I want to offer for pastors and for congregations a few words of advice on how you can possibly tackle this if you're not doing so already. So number one, for the pastors, you need to respond. As we just talked about in the very beginning of this video, how important it is to respond, because number one, it is your job. And number two, you want to make sure that your congregation is informed. And ways that you can do this, even being busy as a pastor, is putting yourself on a schedule. That's one of the beauties about being a pastor, is you can put yourself on a schedule and you can talk about it, because everything in the church, let's go back to the Bible here, should be done in good order and discipline. While every schedule may be different, I do want to talk about one specific schedule that really comes to mind. And I heard this from a pastor named Shane Idleman through a podcast that I was listening to, talking to younger pastors on pretty much how to be a pastor. And in this advice, he talked about how he would have set specific times for specific things. And I can't remember it verbatim, but it was something along the lines of, hey, Monday through Wednesday, I am focusing on the congregation. I am going through prayer requests. I am doing counseling sessions. I am answering questions. Come Thursday, I'm kind of doing 50-50. I'm really into my picking out my sermon topic, developing that sermon, creating the outline, while while dabbling a little bit back with the congregation, but I'm starting to let the elders take a little bit more charge. And then come Friday, Saturday, I am just fully invested into that message. The door is locked, the phone is on Do Not Disturb, and the elders are in full control of taking whatever needs the church has, the elders and deacons. And then on Sunday, the message gets preached. And then the rest of the day, honestly, if any of you have ever preached before, understand that you should probably take a break for the rest of that day. Because preaching, contrary to popular belief, if you've never done it before, it takes a lot out of you. I have preached sermons before, and typically my sermons range anywhere between 40 minutes to an hour, and I would be completely exhausted after one service, let alone if there was a church that happened to have two services or multiple services back to back. It is a very taxing thing, and you are drained afterwards because you are just pouring out your life, pouring out your guts, and pouring out your love through all the studying that you have been doing, through all the prayer that you have been doing, all in the power of Christ. So it's important, pastors, take a rest day. And I know that schedule kind of didn't really allow for one, but you make the schedule how you see best and get other advice from other seasoned pastors in that schedule. Because honestly, if you are leaving yourself no room for a break, you are just going to, as we talked about earlier with Moses, wear yourself down. That also gets into a topic that it is important for you pastors to also take a break every now and again. Take a sabbatical, take a 2-week vacation where you can just detach, be with your family, and just honestly relax for a little bit, because it's not good to overburden yourself. As Jesus said, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. Take a break. Now, pastors, when it comes to responding, I just want to give a little word of advice. This is from someone who is constantly bombarded by leadership and questions, whether it would be through my military life or my Christian life. Give the time to respond and make it a priority for that person. And you can deal with this in multiple different ways. You can do a little matrix if you want of what's most important, or maybe you just go in order of whenever you receive these different messages or whatever the case may be. But make it a priority. You have to respond, and you can go about this through a variety of different ways. I'll tell you what, as a soldier in the United States military, and I will continue doing this when I am out of the military and in full-time ministry, I will have my phone on me 24/7, and I do today, because I never know when I am going to get a message from my bosses in the military, and I never know when I am going to get a message from maybe somebody I am discipling and they are going through something. I want to be there to respond to them regardless of the time. If it's 2 a.m, if it's 4 a.m, if it's 3 p.m, I want to be able to respond to that person and show them that I care, because I genuinely do care. Maybe you don't have the answer right away and you do need to give them the, hey, let me look into this. Then write it down so you don't forget, and do look into that and give them that response. Now, for pastors of larger congregations, maybe this is a little bit more of an issue. And I've seen some creative ways that pastors have dealt with this. One good example is a couple churches that I've known that have large congregations will hold once a month or once a quarter open Q&A session. So it may be on a Sunday night, or it may be after church, or it may be on a Wednesday night. They will hold an open Q&A session where essentially they can put a microphone up there, they can come up, and they can ask you whatever question has been on their heart, and you can go ahead and give them an answer. And these can range anywhere from 1 to 3 hours long. I've seen it multiple different ways, and it really just depends on how you want to run it, but that is a way. Another way that I've seen, and I believe this goes back to Shane Idleman, who I referenced earlier, is make a podcast out of it. Now, it was a while ago that I heard this, so I could be wrong, but I believe he started his podcast simply so he can answer the different questions within his congregation in his own time, because he understood that he wasn't able to get to everything. So essentially, the way I believe it worked was people would submit him the questions, his staff would collect it up, he would look at it, he would study it, and then he would record a podcast episode and push that episode out over the podcast. Now, that podcast ended up blowing up because these questions being asked were questions that many other Christians have. But regardless of that, you are answering your congregation's questions, and you do it in a way where maybe it doesn't have to be as on the spot as an open Q&A session, because I know that can be intimidating, especially depending on how you think and how you study and how you prepare. But it's a way that you can get ahead of all those different concerns the church has. Another way, like we talked about, is in setting that schedule. Set aside a couple days where you can just have people come in and have these conversations with them, whether it would be after work hours, normal work hours for normal people, I mean, the 9 to 5, or during the regular work time, depending on if their job would actually let them out to go ahead and have this lunch meeting or whatever the case may be. For the church that I am currently attending right now, I was very appreciative of the fact that when I first decided to go there, I wanted to have an in-person visit with my pastor, and he was kind enough to clear his schedule out that next week, and we sat and had a 3-hour conversation and got a lot of my questions asked and out of the way, and I was so appreciative of that. And it showed that I was a priority at that point in time, and this person was someone who could disciple me in the faith, especially someone like me who is aspiring to be a pastor when I retire from the military. And while there are multiple other things that we can suggest, lastly, I will say just go ahead and use the form that so many people use today, and that is email. Email is a great way to say, hey, you have a question, I have an email dedicated completely to questions, go ahead and send it to there, and then I will get back with you when I get the time. The careful thing you need to make sure is that that inbox doesn't start piling up with unread messages over and over and over again. But that's just a way. Just like all the other ways that we mentioned, this is a way. It doesn't have to be the way. Regardless, what you are doing as a leader is showing that your congregation is a priority. You want to disciple them, and you actually care about their needs. Next, I want to give some suggestions to the people of the congregation. And we kind of already hit this topic up, but I really want to reiterate it. Be understanding that your pastor is busy, and understand that every single question that you have may not have to go directly to that pastor. Should the pastor be available to you? Yes, I 100% believe it. But some of these questions can be answered by the various elders or associate pastors in that church, or as I even said earlier, they can be answered by maybe somebody in the congregation who is just wise and have been walking this Christian walk of life for a while. This is why it's so important for you as a Christian to have somebody discipling you no matter how long you've been a Christian. So that way you can always go to them with these questions. So as congregations, we need to be understanding of that and not automatically bring the first question that comes to our mind straight to the pastor, but instead use the hierarchy that God had established in the Bible, like we see through Moses, like we see in the book of Acts, and other places throughout the Bible. So with all that being said, I know this episode may sound like I was kind of beating up on pastors and maybe a little bit beating up on congregations, but this is a real issue, and this is an issue that a lot of Christians are dealing with, and I hope that you have learned something from this, whether you are a pastor, an elder, a leader in a church, or a member of a church in a congregation. Tripping all over my words here, but that's what I want to get out through this and impart some of this advice or wisdom that I have learned through my years of going to multiple different churches and seeing multiple different styles and studying this as someone who wants to be a full-time pastor themselves here in the near future. Well, with all that being said, I hope this episode helps you out. And if you want to see episodes more like this, by all means, please drop a comment, subscribe to the channel if you want to get more. Honestly, I love doing this. I do this on my free time, and I just love talking about, as I say in the very beginning, that now what that comes after we believe. And I really want to help the body of Christ grow in this grace and in this knowledge, and ultimately just glorifying God through our everyday lives. Well, with all that being said, thank you once again for listening if you made it this far, and I'll talk to you on the next one.